Now I'd like to talk about some of the emerging market TNCs. As you know, there have been many companies, especially the Chinese companies, are trying to go global. MSCI indices show that emerging markets are really on their global stride, so to speak. They're going greater in numbers. Chinese companies are definitely trying to go global. There are lots of Chinese companies that appear in indices ranging from Forbes 2000 and all the way to Fortune 500 companies. They also try to go into New York, and they try to go to New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange. They try to list their shares. This is a very important and very dramatic strategy on part of this country. If we look at the indices that are created by Fortune magazine, for example, or Forbes magazine, Chinese companies now rival the US companies in number. The number of American companies, of US companies in Forbes 500 is something like 120, and Chinese companies are 110. So they're almost on the par value. China plus the United States make almost half of the list of the largest companies in the world today. If we add to the number of the Chinese companies coming from Taiwan and Hong Kong, I think China would even surpass the United States rankings in this sort of Fortune Global list of the greatest companies. So the number of companies is growing, and also what is growing is their investment opportunities across the world. Such an expansion raises many questions and speculations on part of the local governments, on part of the governments of the advanced countries in the United States and Europe. They fear that Chinese companies are going to conquer their civilized world, are going to damage their image of democratic values. China is, to their mind, an authoritative state which prohibits some human rights, abuses human rights. We've seen that in Hong Kong in the recent months. There were some social unrest in Hong Kong, and also there are talks about China-Taiwanese strains because these two provinces are only on paper Chinese, but in reality actually they are special territories, and they would like to stay independent from the continental mainland China. They are much more developed in terms of GDP per capita and investment per capita, technological bases. And Taiwanese company TSMC is the largest producer of semiconductors in the world. What surprises here the most observers is that, as we know, China is a very successful country in terms of globalization, in terms of its trying to go to the world market, to try to find a broader area, a broader expansion for its companies and corporations, for their technologies. But what surprises is that despite the fact that this is a very successful country and very successful government, very successful in terms of good and prudential macroeconomic policies, still we see things and policies that go beyond our understanding. As we know, Hong Kong is the world financial hub. It's one of the largest international financial centers. And if China is going to be more abusive in terms of human rights, in terms of oppressing people's ideas about democracy and their way of life, their lifestyle, I think China is going to damage its image of a country that is bringing to the world not only capital, but also some sort of Chinese dream, which is also on parts alongside the American dream, is becoming a new reality. Because some countries believe that China is going to be the savior of the world economy due to the simple fact that its economy is the strongest in terms of economic growth. During COVID-19 pandemic, China's GDP growth was the largest. It amounted to close to 3.5%. This is a record among the major economies in the world, and I think China is going to be the only contributor country to the world GDP in 2020, and maybe even in 2021, until the majority of countries in the advanced world, in the rich world, and some emerging countries are going to recover. So this is going to be a very, very interesting point, because I think that's a paradox that a country and a government as successful as the Chinese is trying to damage its own interests and its own image in the world, in terms of their activities in Hong Kong especially, and Taiwan as well. Now, this is not a very good idea, like the United States government says, the United States administration and the new president of the United States. They all say and think that China is really abusive and should be stopped. That's why China is one of the leading objects in the world of American sanctions, of international sanctions, especially the United States sanctions, of course. Europe, like we know, has signed an investment deal with China recently, and this means that Europe is actually going to go together with China in 2020, in the period of 2020s and beyond. European companies, European TNCs, Germans Mittelstand, they are going to be very interested in investments into the mainland of China, because China is a very great market. It's the largest market in the world in terms of population, in terms of the middle class incomes. They're growing in value, and Chinese are very, very great consumers of European cars, of European way of life. They try to be looking like people living in Europe. This is a very interesting phenomenon, and also a very interesting phenomenon on parts of the new China dream in the world economy. So I think China is going to get more sanctions. It's going to face more sanctions on parts of the United States, and the world will be very, very fragmented in these sorts of activities and things. I would like to also say a few words about recent developments in e-commerce. If we talk about Amazon company in particular, this is a very great company in terms of e-commerce activities, in terms of cloud computing services. This is one of the greatest international global companies that is doing business across the borders of many companies and many countries in the world.